All right. We have Andrew Sterling on the show today, and we're going to talk about racism and white privilege. So, welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks, Bradley. It's good to be here. I've watched 2 of them so far. I've liked it so far. Left a super long comment for Dan. I don't know if that's still going on. I'm not the best at checking my YouTube comments, but I like it. I like the idea. What you say?
The idea is to give you a voice for what's important to you, and tell us about you, and then whatever you want to share, and then we'll dig into the good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So, from Nashville, Tennessee, from the South, I was raised to. I forgot the term my dad used to. My dad had a hard job being a huge Southern supporter, and he wanted to give me Southern pride, but he obviously didn't want all the negatives associated with some of the Southern pride movements, or we'll just say some of the things the South is proud of, or sectors of the South. But he taught me to be proud of the South. So there's actually some things that I disagree with. I think it's interesting. Like, I'm married to a biracial woman, so I have this one side that's been able to sort of help me understand other positions, but then I have my upbringing, which is very Southern pride driven. So it's just kind of my journey recently has been to the middle. Like most things, everyone should probably get to the middle. And like I said, that's just most things. Some things you can't get to the middle. But so for me, I basically was hardcore Republican up until probably 21. I was a huge fan of the Koch brothers, huge fan of. There's literally nothing that there's nothing that the Republicans did that I thought was bad. It was to a fault, everyone does stuff bad. You got to recognize that. But I started, go figure, went to college and then started to have a reevaluation of it. Left after I graduated college, spent 7 years there. I, off and on, but still was a Republican, just a little bit less crazy. The same thing when we call the wacky, I think you call them wackadoos is what you have titled some of those people. I was a wackadoo on the right side. But.
Yeah, there's, I think I have, special names for both sides, right? Mm-hmm. So I tell everybody that, I try and maintain that extreme center. And I think based on life experience, I probably lean to the right a lot.
Yeah.
But I also have specific views that support the left, right? So I just tell everybody I'm the only person that can fly because I have both wings. Right? Left wing, right wing, I don't know. But so at some point you transitioned into this center. And
yes, I transitioned. Yeah.
And the transition to center is it's an interesting moment when you actually realize that I call them, the O'Doyles, right? From Billy Madison.
O'Doyle rules. That's my name at every single bar trivia is O'Doyle rules, because you get to chant O'Doyle rules whenever you win.
Sure. And, at some point you lost that within your political mindset, right? Yeah. And you said, I just can't, I'm not going to be right about everything. And it doesn't always have to be one way because it's about more than me.
Yep.
And you transition into this center, and that's a very lonely space to be in, because you get a lot of hate from both sides, because there's a lot of O'Doyles on both sides.
There are, man. There's a lot. I used to be one of them.
And how did your family react to that? Because I get a lot of pushback.
I get a lot of pushback. My dad especially. He's for me, it comes down to who your God is. If a lot of times I find a lot of Republicans willing to excuse the sins of the republic or of the right because their God is the economy, and everything is an economic issue. Everything is filtered through economics. They are usually highly influenced without themselves even knowing by Marx and Engels, who recategorize the struggle from race and nationality into economics. And that was a brand new thing. People really didn't do that like at a mass scale or global scale until then. And they weren't just known for communism. That's the philosophic view that, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So my dad happens to be part of that. He's a Christian, but I think that I call it a false idol. And we all have them. So I'm not throwing him under the bus. I've got plenty of my own. But speaking politically, there's a lot of butting heads because I'm like, okay, you can't. The altar is not economics. Like you can't be. It's not all about that. Mm-hmm. So that's my dad. My mom on the other side, she's more open. She's honestly so, we'll call it pessimistic. She would call it realistic, as all pessimists do. But she's so pessimistic about anything and everything that she just doesn't think anything could ever change. Everything is just sort of like, you doubt all narratives. And considering that the Republicans are largely trying to preserve status quo, and Democrats are largely the ones that, at least in the political realm, trying to bring forward like social injustices, saying like, this is a reality. Let's react to this new reality that you weren't aware of. So my mom happens to, as a result of her lack of trust for everything, I think she finds herself more in the Republican camp than she otherwise would be, because all of these social changes involve sort of trusting like that this new narrative, having new realizations that like, oh, these people are oppressed, or, oh, this thing's wrong, we need to change it. Listen what happened here. All those stories are like deleted in her mind. So she's all about status quo. And I'm not throwing her under the bus. She's also super smart. And she's more handy than I am. She's a great mom, but politically that's where it is. Being in the middle of that is kind of annoying. I have 3 sisters. They're all like kind of scattered. One of them's in the middle with me to a certain degree. Another she moved to New York, and you can probably tell where she falls in the whole spectrum. And the other one has nothing to do with politics. So
that's kind of a nice place to be at too.
I can't blame her at all. We initiated a Thanksgiving no politics rule, so we just did that last year after Trump got elected, and man, it's nice.
Yeah, it's my grandfather growing up used to tell me, I used to spend the summers down in Centerville, Tennessee with my grandparents.
Love Centerville. That lake is nice.
It's I never got to see any of that, but yeah, they had a cows, all kinds of stuff. And my grandpa was a World War II vet, and he said you would get 2 paragraphs out of him a year. That is how little he spoke. But as soon as somebody would bring up anything, he had an adamant rule in any conversation. Didn't matter whether it was at the dinner table or wherever. He would say, "We never discuss sex, religion, or politics."
At the dinner table. At all. Wow.
All.
That seems a little bit much. Those are big issues.
And the reason why he had that, and I always argued, I mean, I was like 14, 15 years old, and I was like, but I want to talk about, why is this way or whatever.
Yeah.
And I didn't appreciate his response then, but he said, that's your path to find and determine on your own. And he didn't want to influence, and he didn't want anybody else to influence. So if you have questions about religion, you go find your answers, right, wrong, or indifferent. But and then through common paths or situations or whatever, you'll kind of find your middle ground. But the politicians, he said, and I was much younger when he said this, and I didn't even understand it until I was like 30. Okay. He said, as long as lawyers are in Congress, your rights will never be represented. They'll be litigated and negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tough, I think I was 11 and I was like, yeah.
Whatever that means. Yeah.
Right? And then I was like 30 and I'm like, wow, these people don't care about us. They care about getting elected and staying elected.
Well, they're so far removed from the people that they represent, and as a result, like, I don't want to demonize these people, man. Like, when we talk about them in the abstract, they sound like pure demons, because they're sacrificing literal lives for money. But I understand. It's the same thing with, I think, with like negative SEO. There's a certain degree where like people are willing to destroy lives because they have this thing that just detaches them so much from the object of their destruction, and as a result, you feel like you can do more.
That was, I don't know if you caught that Craig Campbell thing that I did, or that show that I did with
Oh
Craig.
yeah, I already had that talk with you though privately. We already went through that.
You know, a lot of people just don't realize, you know, life is, or the welfare of people there, they're so far detached from that their actions, they don't see the consequences, like you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And we have to realize that every step we take forward has to be us,
Yep.
right? We, you know. And anyways, I'm kind of taking over your stuff, but
That's a good intro to all the stuff that we're talking about. I think it's also good for those that don't know me, that they just get a flavor for. I feel like if we just jump right into a talk, especially something as controversial as what we're talking about, there's a lot of preconceived notions that someone can have just based on my position alone, as if they know how I got here or something. So I think it's important that we just start to talk and they see it.
I think it's safe to assume that we both probably receive about the same amount of, I'll call it hate, right? From the haters, for completely opposite reasons. You know what I mean? Where you're more of the progressive side of, let's try and make positive change, and I'm throwing the rocks from the side saying you guys are idiots, right?
Yeah.
And so,
that used to be me, like hardcore, and I still do that. That's my natural state, the rock.
Yeah, well, but it's from different points of view, and you and I actually have a lot of differences of opinion.
Yep.
And you know, my whole thing is, let's get people on these interviews, and let's find common ground. Let's talk about those differences, kind of in a Joe Rogan format. Let's have a casual conversation and figure out what we can agree on. You know, because what I see is we're not in a position where we even want to agree with each other anymore. You know, from social media and all of that stuff, media or whatever. So we're going to talk about racism. Which one do you want to talk about first? Racism or white privilege?
I'm going to talk 90% about racism.
Okay.
I think that there's a denial. I'll say this. This has particular interest to me for people who are listening and or watching, is I didn't believe that in racism. I thought it was like a thing, but I didn't think it was like systemic. That, I think that's probably the difference. And I'll go over the definitions of this, but there's systemic racism and then there's just racism. Racism is like at an individual level. Systemic is like at a systems level. So we're talking the police, we're talking about entire schools, educational systems, the government, you know, like that kind of thing. Not saying all of those are all racist. I'm just giving you examples of systemic. So once I started, you know, I grew up with a dad who was an entrepreneur. He made plenty of money, lots of money, six-figure income since I was like 10. Honestly, the only people that in my area in Nashville, it was when I was growing up, it was the top 10 richest county in the nation. I only had white people in my school. I had one black person, and it was the whitest black person I've ever met in my life. That's racist of me to say. I hope people understand what I mean by that. It's just like it wasn't the normal depiction of that. It's more like a Fox News anchor black person, you know, something like that. But
Sure.
Then I started, after getting out of that, went to UT, started going to like, and I was always in private schools too. I started getting involved in like the lives of people that aren't white and middle class, hanging out with more and more poor people, hanging out with, I remember I was kind of like dating this girl that was like living in next to like a trailer park. She was white, but that was like the progress of my life, was like I'm starting to hang out with people in different economic situations and different races. straight up immigrants, straight up people who've Hispanic. My best friend was a Hispanic guy for a little while. I just had all these like different things, and after a little while, the people that you love end up forcing you to not like physically. The love compels you to listen to these people, and you all of a sudden start to elevate their stories, their experiences, you know, like, and so many arguments that people make on social media are all like story based, and those can be written off because there's, for every one story saying A, there's another story saying the opposite. But my particular story is I started hearing a lot of people all saying the same thing. They didn't even know each other, but they're all saying the same thing. So it made me research. So this is what it is.
Where does that come from? Does that come from their upbringing? Do you think?
Does what?
Their behavior of everybody saying the same thing.
So that's my assessment. They are all saying, hey, these are things that have happened in my life. So we'll call them person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Mm-hmm. You know, and they don't know each other. And they're all giving me similar stories of their experiences with the world around them. And it's getting more diverse. These people are now like scattered around. So some people are straight up from Africa. Some people are from Mexico. Some people are just like born here, but happen to have parents that were, you know, immigrants. And once I started hearing that, that's when I was like, oh, there's a unifying thread here. I think racism's a bigger deal than I thought. And I just happen to have friends that aren't douchebags. You know, and I happen to be around people that they're not the kind of racist that is immediately seeable, you know? Mm-hmm. I was racist too. I still am to a certain degree. I think part of racism too is like we are all part of tribes. I think this is the best way to frame it. It's only natural. So your tribe is the one that's most like you, right? It used to be a tribe was all it took was geolocation, and that is your tribe. But now, as you know, a modernized society, our tribes have become thought. We exist in tribes of thought, and as a result, other tribes don't get treated the same way as those within our tribe. So that's where I think that racism exists in all people. It's a very understandable one. And if it's a one that is very understandable, hopefully it's one that we can all get over and just be like, all right, well, like, yeah, admit that. Show me how does that affect me? But that involves getting to know someone. You can't make like sweeping generalizations. You can't judge a book by its cover, just like we were talking about. So before you hit record, we were talking about that. Anyway, so I'm going to go over now some of the history. I created a mind map. We can actually, in the show notes.
Do you want to share it?
Yeah, sure. I can share it. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep. So I'm going to add. There you go.
Perfect. So I'm going to zoom all the way out and show you this is what it looks like. So it kind of goes like this. This thread right here is one thread. This thread right here kind of goes out this way. This thread right here goes up here. And then there's this thread. So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 threads of thought. The main 3 will be narratives. The other ones are kind of definitions. So I'm going to go over that real quick. Let's zoom in. Okay, so let's just get some history up in here. For those that think that Black people have it just as easy as white people to raise themselves up out of economic circumstances, or who don't understand white privilege. This is tracing the thread to show where the privilege exists. So Civil War. So we freed the Black people, right? After the Civil War, I'm saying freed because there's technicalities to that, but history will say that's when they were free. 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the next step then is, well, accept as slavery. Loophole as clear as day. What does this do? Well, the South's entire economy was based on racism, and they got their vehicle for wealth removed, and their land was partially destroyed in the war. So how can these newly poor slave-reliant people recover? Well, you get cheap labor via prisoners. So 13th Amendment said that you literally can have slavery again. You just have to convict them. Well, okay. All of these states are still, you're not magically healed. This is a multi-generational curse and blight on society. And it's going to take a long time. But now they have a way to just keep slavery. So now we have blacks being arrested en masse for things like loitering and vagrancy. And, this is all up until like, really, this is happening up until like 1930. Mid 1930s. It's happening for like 1965, 1935, just about. So how long is that? 60, 70 years? Another 70 years post freed slaves. So then we have Jim Crow laws also existing. Then in 1933, we have President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal provided more federal support to African Americans than at any time since Reconstruction. Federal government had to step in since individual states were perpetuating black oppression. So really the first time I see the federal government stepping in a way to help black people is Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he started these programs for them. And a lot of people have differing opinions about these programs that exist, affirmative action or whatever you want to say, like, there's all sorts of different like echoes of what this thing did, but I'm against them because I think they're carried out poorly. But I think at this point we can agree that black people needed help.
Sure.
And at a state by state level, they were being oppressed. So the federal government has to come in because the federal government at its roots was designed to protect its citizens. So that's what it's doing here. Then we have. How do I get rid of that? Cool. Response to Roosevelt was redlining. So anytime there's a social movement of any kind, there's always a pushback. So response to Roosevelt was redlining. This denies services to whole neighborhoods on the basis of race or ethnicity. The government marked minorities as risky and prevented them from getting access to mortgage lending. The primary way that wealth was grown in America was being not even just America. In the history of the world, wealth is built based on your land. That is why, life, liberty, happiness, like it's so integrally tied to your property. And so now you can't, they're making it harder. That's the goal, is to make it harder. So we keep on going. We have, so now that's going on for like another 30 years. Business as usual. There's still, even though there's programs now and there's still this loitering, vagrancy, Jim Crow laws going on, and there's still segregation going on. So all of this stuff basically culminates in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Attempted to outlaw discrimination on the basis of race and, gender and stuff. But same time that happens, there is a crime increasing due to the baby boom, and it's a natural it's natural. There are more people, denser cities, and more crime happens. That's just what happens. So just like typical people opposing social movements, basically the Civil Rights Act was thrown, or Civil Rights Movement was thrown under the bus, and it was blamed for the increase of crime. So now you have this demonization of really good things once again. Then we have, right after that, all of these things are happening so like bam, 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 bam. It's just like one after another. Anytime some sort of progress is made, there's immediate pushback. So just because they were blamed doesn't necessarily mean that they were oppressed by the government at this time, even though they were immediately blamed. I would say that they're still trying to point to more of like a demonization of blacks. Like the public narrative is still being crafted here, but this in and of itself is not pure oppression by the government. The oppression really hits when Nixon declares war on crime. I hate this just as much as I hate a war on terrorism. You can't declare a war on something as vague as crime and terror.
Intangible.
It's an intangible, and there's very tangible powers that exist in war. So you're getting very tangible powers on the back of very highly untangible circumstances. So I don't like that. So Nixon declares a war on crime, targets two categories. He targets heroin and marijuana. We can agree at least one of those is bad for you. But just because it's bad for you, it kind of presupposes something here. So where is the...
Well, alcohol's bad for you too.
Yeah, sugar is bad for you too. Half of the marketed goods in grocery stores at this time are banned by the FDA now for the stuff that... Our paint, the lead-based paint was bad for us too. Anyway, so basically what this thing does is it targets blacks and hippies. Then we see a shift where drug addiction is treated. I work in drug rehab. I'm an SEO for drug rehab. So, and I come from a family of addicts. I'm very familiar with addiction, and it's very important to me. So what I see here in this moment in history is that there's a shift where all of a sudden drug users are treated as criminals, something that you attack with a gun and with a prison cell. So it's treated as a crime instead of a mental health issue. And that's just weird. Who gets to decide that? Nixon? What? He has no foundation to operate on that would allow him to do that. But that's what happens. And people are, I think there was like a golden age of news where people really trusted news. And the narrative was so strong and anti-black, it just built a generation, multi-generation, with these concepts. And the way that the world existed with getting information, people are too lazy even to Google oftentimes now. Think of how lazy you would, or how hardworking you have to be to actually challenge the narrative back then. You have to go to a library and really dig. So it makes sense. People are busy. People have been busy since the beginning of America. It's people who want to make money.
Here's some good humor for you, but I always told everybody that I've hired for my agency that if my answer to your question is Google it, that's a fireable offense.
Okay. I like the response. Google it.
Yeah. It's just, planned interruptions. But I want to bring up something that I think that we could both agree with is going back to the war on drugs, is that the emphasis on, I think they went back, I think they went backwards full circle, if that makes any sense, that, the attack went down to the lowest level. And that didn't make sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me because that's like, I don't have a good analogy, but, going after the victim versus the predator, I guess, so we went after the victims, and I don't know exactly why that was, the plan of attack, but I think it caused this perpetual failure to happen that, I don't know, it's like blaming the rape victim for being raped.
We're still doing that stuff.
Yeah. Which is a shame, but anyhow, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you contributed to things. So the other step to that little mind map section is just to say that marijuana is now treated as dangerous as well. And that's just kind of weird too. It never exhibited dangers. Even when you smoked it at a young age, they had no conclusive scientific studies that showed that. We now know that it's not good for brain development, but until you're past the age of 25, but it's still not like harming you in the sense that like it's, like crushing your organs or like melting them or something like acid would or something. Anyway, so now Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman caught on tape saying Nixon White House has two enemies: the anti-war left and the blacks. Disrupt hippies and blacks by criminalizing marijuana and heroin. I put the parentheses in there that says attack on hippies, attack on blacks. So literally, we know exactly why they did it. One, they want support for their war. The war machine is very, 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 very. There's so many reasons for it. 30% of our taxes, or 29% of it, goes to the war machine. So it's a lot of money. And the other is blacks. And I'll go into other quotes, and you figure out why the blacks would too. Partially, there's just straight up racism, and people don't like black people still. There's literally, and you got to keep in mind the public narrative here is still that blacks are criminals, blacks are dangerous. At this very time in the Nixon era, Black Panthers were treated as the most dangerous organization to America's democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I have that somewhere in here, which is laughable. They were a small organization and posed very little threat to American democracy. But anyway, so Lee Atwater, he is a Reagan and Bush advisor, said that in 1954, you used to be able to say nigger, nigger, nigger. In 1968, you can't say nigger. Now you go to the abstract and give economic names like cutting taxes or defunding programs. And the byproduct is that blacks are hurt more than whites. So we see, just like you said earlier, Bradley, that you were saying that it's economic, that the way to look at really oppression is, you didn't use the word bourgeois, but it's the bourgeois versus the proletariat is what it is. And this is exactly what I think the heart of the issue is here. He's now using that terminology because as the world changed, the philosophic terms changed. And now we use economic terms, thinly veiled ones. Paul Weyrich.
Is it a different enemy with the same face?
Mm-hmm. It is. So Paul Weyrich, he's the founder of ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. It's responsible for an inordinate amount of our laws across each state. If anyone wants to research it, I recommend you research the history of ALEC. It's really scary. It's basically just a bunch of private organizations mixed with politicians, largely Republican, massive companies getting together and just making laws. And basically a representative will just get these laws. They trust ALEC. They're part of the program, but they don't really know who made it other than the name ALEC. But it's copy paste. It's literally just, in some circumstances, it's literally one representative, I can't remember where he's from, Republican representative, forgot to take off the logo for the ALEC bill in the header. Literally, they have spin tacks in their documents that say insert state here.
Sure.
It's literally, it's cut and paste. And like people would just do it and they don't even have to read it because it's got the support of all these big companies and stuff. Yeah, that fate.
Are both sides guilty of that?
Primarily Republicans, unfortunately. I wish it was more both sides, but it's primarily Republicans. Democrats are in there too, but yeah.
It seems to me that, and I'm going to kind of take the side of your mom at this point, right? Mm-hmm. That I see as the independent, and I'm always skeptical of both sides. Mm-hmm. And I do pay attention to both of them. And it's like, wow, who paid for what you just said? You know what I mean? Who's paying you to say what you just said? And I blast people regularly. I mean, what's his name? Devin Nunes. Mm-hmm. He said something on Parler, and I said, great idea. Why don't you get after it? Direct message to him. And then, oh, yeah, well, maybe I should do that. I don't know. They just all seem like they're a dog and pony show at this point. And, I'm going to take your mom's side at this point, and probably not yours or your dad's. But I look at it, and I'm like, who paid for this? Who paid for that? Where's this coming from? Yeah. And then you just start digging. I don't know. But I agree with that, what you just said to a point. But I hope that we can at least acknowledge the fact that not only does it exist on both sides, but it is becoming more and more of a, it is just expounding upon itself that these elected officials are finding themselves in that position of taking money to have an opinion, which I think is un-American. I mean, they're supposed to be representing their constituents, not the United Dairy Farmers, as an example, right? Regardless of their political party. Is that an agreement?
I would say in response to that it makes sense why basically your reaction, my mom's reaction, is the exact reaction those in power want people to have. Because if that's the reaction, they're already in power. So all they want is to preserve their power. To preserve their power, all they have to do is muddy the waters. Because then if they don't trust anything, the power doesn't go away. Because nothing can challenge it. Truth, it doesn't exist in the narrative. Like, there can be no truth. So for those that are already in power, I think it's united. Honestly, I would go so far to say that the Democrats and the Republicans have a closer relationship than citizens think.
Now you're speaking my language.
Yeah, I think it's literally the same people in power, and if there needs to be a villain every single election cycle, and there needs to be a hero, and they swap and they take turns. It's the same reason why we see it's the revolving door of C-suite leadership and politics. We see them going in and out, in and out. Same thing, Democrat, Republican, in and out, in and out. And I can either say that it's either the entire organization and like large percentage of the organizations know about it, or it's just like select few that kind of pull the strings just enough, and it happens. But
I'll give you an example. We have a guy in Congress here from Minnesota, and I was super excited to see him get elected.
Yep.
His name's Dean Phillips.
Yep.
You heard of him?
No.
So he's a Democrat, but he's not really a Democrat. He's kind of an independent. And he was running against an incumbent Republican. Mm-hmm. He exposed all of these things in his campaign process against everybody, even the Democrats and the Republicans. And he was really just mouthing off to, all of them, the Pelosi's of the world and everybody. And he swore up and down that when he got elected, and his notable thing was he's a very wealthy guy, has a lot of family money behind him, but he drove around Minnesota in like an old ice cream truck for his campaign thing.
Creepy.
It made a whole bunch of sense. And I just ate it up to the point where if I was in his district, I would have gone out and voted for him. Right. Which I don't just vote for anybody. So he got into Congress. I want to say it was like 2 years ago, or maybe it's 4 years ago now, but haven't heard a word from him. And it pisses me off. You know what I mean? Because I'm like, dude, you were the guy. You were the guy that said all of the things. And then literally, I just mentioned the name Dean Phillips, and you're like, Dean who? Right? Yeah. That if he had done even one single thing that he had campaigned on, once he got in, if he had just accomplished one single thing, everybody would have known his name. But he's literally, I can't think of a single thing that he's accomplished since he's been in. I think they're all kind of getting into this system of, I don't even know what you call it, like this elitism or classism. It's like they're separating themselves as soon as they get elected. And
I don't even know if it's that. It's literally like you work for your whole life to attain something, and you have a dream, and then it's the moment that the dream becomes of the position or the power or whatever becomes more important than your own convictions. And it happens so often, I think, that when people are given the option, they believe they're going to change the world, or they believe that, what their point in this world is to do, I'm going to be a politician. I'm going to change the laws. When I get money, I'm going to give it to everybody, that kind of personality, right? Mm-hmm. Then they get money, and then the same exact temptations that exist for every single person in that position all of a sudden hit them, and they act the exact same way. The person that all of a sudden gets wealthy isn't quite as giving as they thought they might. Sure. The person that gets into politics isn't quite as maybe they are, but maybe they were they had an unrealistic expectation about the powers that be, and they were forced into submission, essentially. So that's what I think.
Let's talk shop for just a moment, because in without getting real specific, but I think I fall into that category at times too, from a business perspective, and I'm sure that you do too. Where, I think I don't know this, but you're constantly being asked questions relative to industry expertise, and at some point you're like, no, I gotta do my thing, you know. So I use the example of 2019 we built 89 websites for people for free, right? Just to help them out. Hey, you just need this. Hey, if I just had this, I'd be better at this. Or if I just had this, blah, blah, blah. And then 2020 came around before any of this crazy stuff happened. And I was like, you know what? I'm done. And I think we built about 12 websites, maybe more than that, but I can only think of 12 that we've built for free for other people. And I finally realized that I was taking away from other people unintentionally, employees and everything else, by providing these free services. So we were lowering our profitability. We were lowering our revenue model. And I think that there's a tough balance there, right? As far as protecting what you have versus being generous to those who you may or may not know, to improve their situation. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that is fair.
And the reason why I brought that up is going into the racism part, right? So I think, and I'm hoping you'll talk around that a little bit, of the have versus the have nots. And maybe part of the hurdle is not necessarily based on race, but maybe it's the have versus the have nots, and how much am I willing to give somebody else of what I have? Where does my generosity fall off?
Yeah.
Because if we apply what you just said, and we apply that to, say, West Virginia, right? Or even, you could use Kentucky, or even parts of Tennessee. If you use Centerville, where there's some extreme poverty that happens in your home state.
Yep.
That the people aren't in a position that if you gave them $100, they wouldn't even know what to do with that $100, because they've never had it.
Right. So many people bought a big screen TV with their $1,200 check.
Sure. And that's not necessarily based on race.
No, not at all.
That's just based on
education.
Yeah.
I think, because if you're educated, then you know how to preserve wealth, and you know how to increase wealth. That's what education does.
And I'm swaying the conversation back to my economical position.
I think it's very much economic. I just don't think it's all economic.
Oh, I agree. Because I want you to dismantle that with your next.
Yeah, for sure. I'll say this too, is that I've written a lot of papers in my lifetime. I've probably written maybe 20 or 30 papers that are all above maybe 20 to 40 pages each. I've done a lot of big papers in my life. And one of them was on microloans, and was around the idea of helping people to the point that it hurts people. And we basically need to be wise with how we want to help people. So I think it's important to say that we can use the example of Tom's. You ever heard of Tom's Shoes?
Yeah.
Okay. They crippled a third world economy by giving free shoes to every pair of shoes you buy. We give a pair to somebody in need. It crippled a huge market where basically you just took away thousands of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're just giving it for free to these people, and you're making them reliant upon you. So at a certain point of getting free shoes, at what point do the artisans stop making shoes entirely and you lose that skill set? If you never need it, then you just don't have it. So after a little while, what ended up happening is Tom's pulled out of certain areas, and then it left the economy sort of dependent upon them. And there is this huge shock that ends up happening. So when we help people, when we're talking about some of these affirmative action type things or like handouts and stuff, there needs to be wise ways of doing this. We need to offer a hand up and not handouts is sort of that idea. So it's really, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm not going to really define that. That would take, a 30-page paper.
Sure.
I'm not going to do that. But I just want to make people aware that I recognize that there are complicated ways to help people. And usually the only way to really help people is you have to sacrifice your time and not just your money. And most people, when they want to help people, it's easier to just throw some money, especially if you're wealthy. Well, I give 25% of my income. I'm a great person. Yeah, but what if that 25% went to a cause that crippled an economy?
Mm-hmm.
It can happen. It happens all the time.
And there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, there are a lot. And people, they have their heart in the right place. I have donated to causes that do this. So the only time I think that this sort of like handout, like the Tom's model would work is, I think it was Warby Parker, where every pair of glasses that you bought, they gave to somebody. That's highly specialized. And a lot of these people in third world countries don't have access to that. They're not removing jobs. They're giving people access to something they otherwise wouldn't have. That's different. Same with medication. I think those are important ways.
The other thing that I tend to, and you've seen me state this on social media a lot.
Yeah.
It's really convenient to form your worldviews from the balcony of your all-inclusive resort.
Yeah.
And I piss people off all the time with that statement because, I would say, I tend to punch people in the face and get their attention, but I tell people, have you ever seen a child that's a day or two away from starving to death? Those are the impacts that we have when we just blindly do different things and we don't realize the repercussions because there's no accountability. It's just, here's $1, here's $1, here's 10, here's 50, here's whatever. And I think people, the last show that I did with Scott, it was entitled Ignorance. Or
is that the Japan one?
Yeah.
I love Japan.
And it was just a difference of culture. How are they doing things based on, if you use Japan, thousands of years versus our 200 or 300 years or 400 years or whatever you want to get, 600 years, it doesn't matter. But they've already gone through those struggles and they've worked through the struggles and they've formulated a culture based on community versus individualism. That's way off topic. But I think, part of that is building the community, building the community here, like you're talking about, that it isn't about, I don't care what color somebody is. I really don't.
And I'm not going to get into this too much, but I suffice it to just say that if you want to change something, regardless of your position, let's say you really don't believe racism exists, or you really don't believe white privilege exists, or you just don't want to listen to me. Listen to this one thing. The best thing you can do to change anything is to move towards more community-centric and less individualistic. America is built on individualism and there's a lot of good that comes from that. I would say that the counseling revolution, the idea that like, hey, you're messed up and counseling is not embarrassing. You should get counseling. Mm-hmm. That happened because it's like an importance of the individual. And I think that there's a lot of good things that happen from that. Just like in Japan with their community-centric view, there's a lot of good things, but there's also terrible things that happen. But as Americans, our job is to move more towards the center. And the center would be implementing individualism and community. And we're doing a terrible job of community, and we're just focusing on social media. We want our echo chambers. We want our tribes of thought, and that's what we want. And our job as good human beings is to get out of that.
It's kind of like a gang mentality, isn't it?
It is. It's a gang mentality, and we judge other gangs, the violent gangs, but we're doing gang-like stuff all the time.
That's probably one of the biggest areas of pushback. I mean, you want to see me piss off thousands of people all at once?
Yeah.
When I tell them, they'll say, well, are you a Democrat or a Republican? You know what? I'm an independent. I've never really wanted to join a gang. right? You'll see their heads explode, right?
They are a gang, man. They're totally a gang. I vote. I've been voting for the past 2 election cycles independent, and the narrative that like I hate the thing. It's like you're throwing away your vote. Well, if you look at the election, if our view is just the one election cycle, and you want to influence that one election cycle, yeah, it's a throwaway vote. But I am educated, and I know that sometimes to build something, I want a successful agency that's pulling in 7 figures. You have to have future view, and the decisions I make now, I'm thinking about 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
And with your voting, you can do the exact same thing because it applies. And that is, if you're upset with the 2-party system and you think it's manipulated, and you think one of the ways to help it is to get out of that, well, start voting independent. Yes, you're going to throw away your vote. But honestly, look at the past 20 years. What has changed? It goes Democrat, the swinging door, Republican, Democrat, undo everything Obama did, redo everything Obama did, or whatever the previous president did, over and over and over. Like, no earth-shattering thing is going to change by you throwing away your vote. But I think it's important that if people are like us, are tired of like the gangs,
Mm-hmm.
find someone in the middle. If all it takes is, last election cycle we had 5%. That's a record. If we can get 10% the next cycle, man, let's keep that progression. In 3 election cycles, if we could get up to 20%, at that point you have a legitimate organization with tons of funding, and they're going to be heard and they're legitimized. So I just think that people need to like kind of prolong the way that they think about their voting. Anyway, that's a side note. I need to keep going through this. We're at 51 minutes. We've got a lot more.
Go for it, man.
All right, so Paul Weyrich, the founder of ALEC, I discussed what this American Legislative Exchange thing does. It's ridiculous. But he's a co-founder, and he says, I don't want everybody to vote. And a part of us all know this if we're part of the gang. I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in elections goes up as the voting populace goes down. He said that. And that's the person that's doing like massive percentage of our laws. I want to say it was like, I'm not going to throw out any numbers. It's a massive percentage of our laws are passed by this person who's actively leading, a ton of politicians in big business from like, we're talking like Walmart, GE, Apple, like that size kind of thing. Those are the people, and they're under ALEC, or they were until they kind of got outed. ALEC is redefining itself currently. Anyway, so let's go over here now. So we have ALEC War on Crime. Reagan basically actualized the Nixon war on drugs with a very real militarization of the police followed by harsher laws. So if you want to find the culprit for where we're at today with BLM, with Black Lives Matter, it happened because of this thing right here. It started with Nixon, and Reagan actualized it. And basically we have military. And then to go to Democrats, I go over and show how Clinton is involved too. It's not just the Republicans here. And during the debate too, it's important to note that when we talk about Republicans, or during this whole entire process, this mind map, it's important to recognize that Republicans and Democrats flip-flopped. And when you talk about if the Republicans' fault, well, the Republicans of 60, 70 years ago were the Democrats of today. So as we have these discussions, make sure that you're aware of that before you demonize your own side on accident. So the ALEC War on Crime, Reagan actualized. We have some other things that happen too with legislation that is racist. We have voter ID laws of 2008. Oh God, why is this? Don't we all want to make sure our elections are fair and that we have confidence in the vote? Heck yeah. Have we caught people like at a mass scale with voter fraud? Do we need to take action? No, we don't. They unfairly target minorities for no reason. Studies show that only 31 credible cases of voter fraud out of 1 billion votes exist, and 25% of blacks don't have valid IDs. It's just one more hurdle. And you want to know who did these laws? It's friggin' ALEC. It's like, it's these organizations, it's these politicians. Like, it's just follow the thread.
So here in Minnesota, they had a problem where, so they had what they called a duplicate list.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is what I'm about to say is so ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't enforcing voter ID laws,
mm-hmm.
right? And my thing is, I don't know how I feel about it. I really don't feel about it, to be honest with you. But what Minnesota would do is they would post this duplicate list outside of the voting booths, right? And they got caught doing this in certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
My immediate backyard in St. Paul was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So you would go in and you would vote. And you didn't need a voter ID. You didn't need any form of voter ID.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd walk out. And as soon as you walked out of the building, you'd get back in line and you just look for a name on the duplicate list that hadn't voted yet. And then go back in and vote again.
Yeah.
And they were doing it intentionally.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the problems that I had is they'll show up here in my neighborhood and, we're a very diverse culture. I mean, if you look at, you're hard pressed to find an all white neighborhood or even an all black neighborhood in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Because everybody is just, everybody lives together. So they would show up in our neighborhoods with these vans and they'd pick up whoever was going to go to the voting booths and take them to the voting booths and literally showing them how this process works. And I don't know. So I don't know where I'm at with that, because I do think that in order to keep that election fraud from happening, there has to be a check and balance, but I don't know if it's one thing or another. You know what I mean? I don't exactly want to say.
Keep in mind that issue that you're talking about could have ended by just removing that list.
Mm-hmm.
So really, you didn't have to make it harder for 1/4 of black people.
Sure.
And I will say this too, is that 25% of blacks don't have a valid ID. Some people might ask, well, how many white people are affected? It's 8%. 8% of white people are affected. And if you remember what I said earlier, is that these laws and these hurdles are meant to just disproportionately affect black people. It's okay if some whites are affected.
How about Hispanics?
What'd you say?
How about Hispanics?
I can't remember with Hispanic. I do have some Hispanic percentages on here. But I do not remember for voter ID laws. It affects them a lot too, though.
That would be an interesting comparison, because I think that the Hispanic communities are often put side by side with the black communities as far as how laws are passed and what the initiatives are.
Yep.
I don't know. I just see them as being equally targeted.
They are, especially in certain states,
mm-hmm.
Like New York City, or New York, for instance. So, speaking of Hispanics, we have, and I'll also say this is presidential elections too. So the issue, we have a good system for presidential elections, and there's only 31 credible cases of voter fraud. This was back at a study done in 2014. There's multiple studies separate studies that say the same thing. Anyway, so more stuff. ALEC, we have these laws. ALEC is sort of just going to be the catch-all for like these laws that are happening, but we have a SB 1070 immigration law, and that's basically the exact same thing as stop and frisk with New York. It's the ability, basically what you do is to be able to target, anytime you want to target minorities, you just instill fear. That's all you got to do. These guys are criminals, they're coming into your state, they're trying to rape your women and trying to steal your children, steal your jobs, and they're bringing drugs and terrible, terrible things. And people get afraid, and once they're afraid, they're like, yeah, SB 1070 sounds good. Let's just allow you to stop anyone you want, whenever you want. It's ridiculous. Also, there's studies that show that like when cops police like that, the aggressive policing, it makes their job harder for them, and it creates movements like Black Lives Matter. The more police you add to the situation, and the more aggressive, like the more they're just like constantly interrupting your life, the more friction you're creating. until all of a sudden explosions of violence come out. So anyway, so then we have a huge percentage of politicians were part of ALEC, and it's basically acted as a copy-paste law, making that benefited politicians, big business, financial powers backed laws that prevented change and that disproportionately affected minorities. So I've already kind of covered that. So let's keep this thread over here. We have publics educated by government and media to make people into their crime. This right here, this thing, that's a drug user, not a black person. This is like, they are a criminal. They are a drug user. They are in a gang. And then all of a sudden, all you have to do is create powerful symbolic associations. And then we're no longer thinking of people. We're thinking of, this is a drug user. And, I saw in the nightly news what drug users are about. So these are the kind of things that really affect old people. And they're the ones that vote like a lot. And that's what he meant earlier when he says that all we have to do is right here. I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in elections goes up as the voting populace goes down. The people that still vote are old people, and they're highly motivated by fear. So usually the people that have things to lose, right? Like old people have acquired their wealth. They've acquired their stuff. They have stuff to lose. Young people don't. When I was young, I had nothing to lose. Still young, I'm 30. So then we have things, let's see. Oh, blacks buy. This is the thing that's kind of crazy, is that the public's educated to believe black people are criminals, and it's not just whites buying into it. Blacks buy into the messaging after a while too. Hoover's quoted as saying that Black Panthers are most dangerous threat to democracy when they were tiny and had very little power. Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers was killed in his sleep at 4 a.m. next to his pregnant wife, and he was one of the Black Panther leaders. And you know what? One of his main things was, it was actually to work to end violence between gangs. And he was loved by multiple different antagonistic gangs, and he was working to help solve the issue. But you know what? We kill him. White people kill him. White people in power kill him. Weird. It's just weird. Basically, what's happening is that anytime someone squeaks through the filter that the government has placed, or the powers that be, I'll say big business and government, occasionally you still get leaders. You get Martin Luther Kings. You get Fred Hamptons of the world. They either die or go in prison. Or get demonized entirely. Now it's more of like the way that people, or the government and the people in power, fought the Fred Hamptons of the world. That's how they fought them back then. It's gotten more advanced. Now all you have to do is, since the message is largely people live in their digital worlds, all you have to do is muddy the pond, and no leader matters anymore. And once again, power gets to be preserved by the status quo. So then we have Willie Horton smear. This one's an interesting one. Basically, Dukakis had supported a presidential candidate, for those that don't know, had supported this sort of prisoners get vacations occasionally, where they get some sort of relaxation of their oppression in prison during the weekends or something. Anyway, so I can't remember the exact story, but essentially one of the guys that was a benefactor of this idea ended up, I think, getting out raping somebody. So the marketers that basically worked with Bush Sr., won the race versus Dukakis, was entirely built behind the harsher treatment of criminals on the back of Willie Horton. So he was actually 10 points behind Dukakis until this excellent marketing campaign. But the point of bringing that up is just to say that what's happening is, ever since Nixon in the 70s, harsh treatment of criminals has existed. So, and I'll show you up here. I'll do a little pause. The prison population evolution, 1970 is 357,000 people. 1980 was 513,000 people. 1985 was 759,000 people. 1990, we're now at 1.17. That's million. 2000, 2,015,000. 2011, 2.3 million. How many are just black? We're not even talking full minorities. We're just saying black. Almost 50%. 878,000 of those are black. So you either think, if you deny racism at this point, you either think that black people are just more violent, or you're seeing more of a systemic issue here. But I don't think that black people are any more violent. And what's crazy is blacks are only 13% of the population.
Right. So let me throw out a phrase: victims of circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a real thing? I mean, I make a lot of claims regarding some very terrible things that, again, my intention is to slap people in the face.
Yeah.
And then let's have a conversation. But I made a comment that the prison population, one, I agree on the standpoint of nonviolent offenses versus violent offenses.
Yeah.
But my problem comes into play with the Carla Dominguez, and I can't even pronounce the other guy's name, the one who was released, waiting trial for raping her, and then goes back and finishes the job. That just happened within the last 2 weeks.
Yep.
But was let out. I think that, one, if it's a violent offense, regardless of anything else, that does need to be dealt with in a very harsh manner. But at the same time, we have an overwhelming number of nonviolent offenders who, in again, taking the race out of it, right? Because I think that affects the Hispanic culture. It does affect the Black culture, but I think there's a lot of Hispanic or even Asian, or it doesn't matter, prisoners at this point who are in the wrong place, because while they're in the wrong place, life is moving past them, and then they find themselves in a position of that they can't find a job when they get out. That they can't do all of these things. They can't move past their past, or they can't get past their history.
We don't help them. They're not allowed to vote.
Right.
Once this is the thing. This is where the racism is like, oh, well, normally you can vote your people in to change the situation. But all we have to do is send you to prison, and now you don't get to vote. So you're stuck.
So going back to the Carla Dominguez thing, that really pissed me off, because here we let somebody out over a health pandemic who was going through the trial process for a very I don't even know what the term is right now. It's slipping my mind, but a very violent rape of this woman who he is set to be, set to go to trial. Now we have a health pandemic, and the judge releases this guy, and then he turns around and kills his accuser. And I just thought to myself, when does a suspected, or he's not convicted yet, but at what point did his life, based on our current health pandemic, become more important than the victim? And I don't think, I think, again, that goes back to the Hispanic side, or, I think she was Hispanic and he was Black.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of a muddy playing field. You know what I mean? That we're going so far past. If we look at the case from California, and that was a Hispanic guy that was released who was a sexual predator based on this health pandemic, and then he locks himself in a car with a 2-year-old and starts making out with the 2-year-old in the grocery store parking lot as mom's putting the groceries in the car. You know what I mean? So there's, I don't know, I just don't think it's an A-B simple solution.
Well,
does that make sense?
It does, but keep in mind that you're pointing out very obscure, isolated, not completely isolated, but it's a rarity. It is not common for that kind of thing to end up happening. And just because it doesn't, we got to put equal weight here. So does a few allegorical stories or anecdotal evidence, does it validate an entire opposition to a way that we do something? Maybe not, but does it at least validate us inspecting it?
Opposition opposition versus opportunity, right? That we can actually, because I'm a firm believer that our prison system is broken.
Totally.
Way, I mean, for different reasons that I can't even share, but uh, I don't know. We're kind of getting off track, but I think I see what you're saying, and I would actually challenge the numbers that you gave based on population growth, not based on percentage of race, but why are we confining more people? Does that relate to population growth within our country over that same period of time? Did that number grow hand in hand or step in step?
We've been growing in population always. We're always growing in population, but the law, what you're seeing with these is a direct correlation to laws that are put into place
Mm-hmm.
and the amount of people that are put into penitentiaries. It's so connected that it's more connected than just pure population. To a certain extent, the prison population will grow. But let's look up something.
And I'm not even looking at the race side of it. I'm just looking at the numbers, right? So the number of people incarcerated as a percentage over a period of time. So we've grown by 85 million since 1990.
So we have 328 and
70,
250.
78,
So how much percentage?
78 million. So we've grown by 78 million, which is nearly 30%. Is that right?
Actually, here you go. This is the better number. 309 to 250. So to grow by 60 million is about a 27% growth.
Yep.
Yet
so if you take 1990's number,
yet we're seeing 1.17 to 2.3. So what ends up happening here is that in the course of 20 years, even though the population only increases by 27%, it doubles.
Sure.
Doubles.
Yeah, I'm just asking a question.
I know. I'm saying out of amazement that it's like you made an important distinction that there are other variables, and correlation does not prove causation. But what we're seeing here is that there's a 100% growth in 27% growth of population, and of that growth, 878,000 are Black. 13% of the population accounts for almost 15% of prison. Then we're not even counting about Latinos. So here we go. Prison shows a legal system unfair to Black people. The oppression didn't always end in imprisonment. It could just be aggressive treatment by police or something like NYC stop and frisk, which is now debunked and ended, and had 57% Black people that were stopped, 31% Latino. Both categories accounted for 51% of the NYC population, yet accounted for 88% of all stop and frisks. So this is basically part and parcel of what we're talking about. It's saying, except exactly what's crazy with NYC though, is even they account for a larger percentage of that population, but there's still 88% of the people that the police have deemed suspicious are Black and Latino. And how many of those end up in minor drug charges? How many of those end up in just like, it's the same exact thing as being arrested for loitering. It's the same exact thing that's been happening since the very beginning, where we used laws at one point to keep slavery, and now we're using laws in order to stop voting, basically, and to basically suspend any sort of social that involve a lot of money and time. So, and honestly, I think people are going to get tired of the rich white guy, leading the country if the more legitimacy that racism gets. People might not want that. Anyway, so let's go back. Let's finish this little section now. So Clinton's 1994 federal crime bill, this acted as the infrastructure for the police issues we have today. Once infrastructure was created for the bias that had been taught, it acted as the foundation for the current state of affairs with police. Basically, after years of presidencies that were mainly Republican, the Democrats decided to focus on crime, which led to the Clinton nomination. So basically, Democrats saw like, wow, all right, well, we're going to have to adopt a more centrist view because, what's winning is fear. So we're going to have to do the same thing and run on these issues. And Clinton did that very successfully. So what's interesting, though, is Clinton implements a bunch of things. He adds 100,000 people to the police force. He implements the 3-strike policy. Basically, on your third crime, you're out. You're gone for life. Discretion was taken away from judges. So basically, judges used to have the power to kind of treat people as people, and instead of just looking at a bunch of like numbers and treating people like a math problem, they're able to see that they're encouraged to and trained to look at the context. And basically that was taken away. Context doesn't matter. They did that. Life. Mandatory sentencing was implemented. No matter what. 95% prosecution. Basically everything went to the prosecution at this point for going to jail. And 95% of those people were white. That's not saying that like there's like this deep, dark power that's making sure only 95% were white. But it just so happens that legally speaking, blacks have been oppressed. It makes sense to me that there's not going to be much representation with prosecution lawyers with black people. But the point of the matter is they're not represented. And what ends up happening, I've left this out, but there's other things that are just ridiculous, man, like crack cocaine epidemic. So the crack cocaine epidemic was treated 10 times worse than normal powder cocaine. It's like the same thing. But you know who uses crack cocaine? Black people. You know who uses powdered cocaine? Primarily suburban people. So at that point, like, yes, it's not just going to be not just going to be white people using it. There will be some black people, but like, it's always about disproportionate effects. That's always what people are trying to do. So that was another thing that was done. Another crazy thing about crack cocaine is that now we're finding out that the CIA, this is not as proven as the numbers that I'm giving you. So I'll just say that this is more conspiratorial. Everything I've said up to now is not conspiracy, except for the one thing about my conspiracy about Democrats and Republicans being related in some sense for sharing power.
And marriage. They're related by marriage.
There you go. They're related by marriage. So CIA with the Contra Contra issue, where basically they were funding people, cocaine smugglers, and helping that entire industry during a time where the crack cocaine boom was happening, during a time where all of a sudden they legally were punishing people for doing it, even though the government themselves were responsible for that boom because they were trying to get involved in other countries' affairs. That part was proven, the fact that they were literally working with other countries to start revolutions. So there's a person that went a step further, a reporter in California, and I believe his 3 articles that he's written on it that talks about this. But of course, they couldn't nail down the CIA. On 3 different occasions, they had at-bats to try to nail the CIA on that one. But, turns out you couldn't nail them down.
Walk through this with me, because somebody asked me a question, and like I said, every once in a while I say some fairly intelligent things by accident.
Yep.
And the more I think about my response to this person, I said, wow, I said that actually makes more sense after I keep thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But somebody actually put me on the spot and they said, what's the solution to the race problem that we have? Yep. And I said, get rid of it.
Yeah, but how? You can't ignore it if it still exists, because then the people that are being affected by it are still being affected, but now we're just not talking about it or identifying ourselves by race. But the fact of the matter is, we've been oppressing a people group for so long, their identity is partially wrapped up in the oppression.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at it from the top down,
Mhm.
right? So if we eliminated the ability for the government or media or any of these people to identify, because I think that that became part of the problem. We all end up becoming more tan as time goes on.
Yep.
And you know, I think that part of the easy, I don't know, it's not easy. Nothing's easy, but we have this convenient, just convenient ignorance in front of us that allows us to put people into buckets.
Yep.
Right. And I look at it like, let's look at it like a farm. We have a whole bunch of cows inside of a fence. Just open the gate. Right. And,
Mhm.
it's the small bucket versus the big bucket. But what if we just eliminated all of that? Because one of the things that really just absolutely hurts my soul is the ability of this elitist class of people, being the politicians,
Mhm.
to then use the media to cause divisiveness
Yep.
because they don't want you and I to talk to each other, whether they want us to disagree with each other.
Yep.
Because if we start talking and we start finding common ground, well, then we're also going to realize they're bullshit, regardless of side. And I actually think that that is probably, hopefully, going to be found out as one of the biggest injustices of my lifetime, is the idea that we need to further define people based on a race, which allows everybody else to take a side. If we just eliminate that from not in look at the standpoint of have versus have not, instead of based on race. I don't know. It sounds kind of crazy, but it might actually work.
So I do agree. It sounds nice, but the problem is all of these different laws that are existing that are targeting race without mentioning race. How are you going to stop that? Because, like I said earlier, over here, Lee Atwater pointed out very astutely that all you have to do is change the racial stuff into economic terms. So he's saying racism can flourish when we're only using economic terms, because we can still do economic things that influence just one race. We're not talking about it. And Black people don't have to identify themselves as Black, or we don't have to talk about Black people at all, or white people or Hispanic people. The fact of the matter is, people in power are still doing things that affect people that happen to be a race. So how do we stop them from doing that? Telling them, hey, it's the haves and have-nots, it's not going to change anything, because they're still doing things based on, and it kind of that, the haves and have-nots, but they're doing it based on racism, or they're doing racist things. So that's my one pushback on that. It's just that, like, it's already, the racism's being continued with economic terms, which is the haves and have-nots. That is an economic term.
Sure. And I don't even disagree. I'm talking about just literally handcuffing the powers that are, right? That you don't get to discuss this anymore in this way, because in the end, we're all Americans anyways. So if we're defining what benefits this specific group, and we start compartmentalizing that into using their own weapons against them, if you will, right? You want to talk about economics? Well, great. Everybody who has a median average income of less than $32,500 fits into this category, and we need to work to progress this. You see where I'm going with that?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if it's a young single white mother, or a young single Black mother, or a young single Hispanic mother. None of that matters, because we've taken that ability for the lawmakers on this end to target a specific group, which makes it convenient. You see what I'm saying?
Yes. Even I will add this too, though, is that redlining still targeted groups, Hispanic or Black, without actually they didn't have to say Black or Hispanic. They targeted it based on income, and they targeted it based on economics once again. And racism was allowed through redlining, and redlining continued for like 40, might have been 70 years. It was a long time. It didn't stop till like 77. And even then, it's still happening now under people's noses, but like it was a really rampant issue. And I like the idea of just identifying, let's help people under this bracket. But the fact of the matter is, they're not allowed to target as a politician race, they can still target race, and they have been targeting race without mentioning race. Mm-hmm. So if we take away their speech and we say you're not allowed to do it anymore, they're still going to do it. Is all I'm saying. They've been doing it. They figured out the way to do it. So we have to figure out a way beyond what you're suggesting.
Did you ever see? I don't know which episodes you watched, but the whole thing with my son and race identification. Did you catch that at all?
No.
So I'll tell it again, just because it's important to me. When he was 12, he came out, and my son is half white, and he's a quarter Hispanic and a quarter Black. His mother was half Black, half Hispanic, and he was 12. I raised him as a single dad, and he came out and he said, "Dad, what am I?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" You know what I mean? He's 12. I'm gonna get rid of your screen share for just a moment.
Yeah, go for it.
You can see this. So my son, he said, "What am I?" And I said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "Am I white?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "But am I Hispanic?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, am I Black?" I said, "Yup." And he said, "But I have to choose one, Dad." I said, "No, buddy, you're American, right?" I mean, in the end, none of that mattered. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, as he was going through, I raised him in Hastings, Minnesota. If you want to look up Hastings, Minnesota from a demographic standpoint, it's about 99.99999 white, right? And he's literally the only tan kid in town. And he would go in and he would have to take a test, and he'd have to mark a box. And he's like, "What am I?" "Buddy, you're American." I mean, we went through this process, and even to this day, he struggles because he actually said something. He said, "Well, he's not white enough, and that's obvious based on skin color. He's not Mexican enough for the Mexicans to accept him. He's not white enough based on skin color, just face value, and he sure isn't Black enough because he looks Italian," right?
Yeah.
And we went through all of these things, and then we went through it again with college.
Yeah.
As he's filling out his application, "Well, what race are you?" And he didn't fill it out. And they kicked back his college application. "You have to choose a race." And I'm like, why? Why is that important at all? I mean, it's beyond me just how, I don't know what the best word is, foolish we are at this point of a connected, technologically efficient, whatever you want to call it, that my son at age 18 has to put himself into a bucket. Why is that?
It makes sense. I understand what they're doing, but I think has some negative consequences.
Sure.
The positive is that by marking Hispanic, Native American, by marking these different groups, what we want, one of the social movements and one of the things that we should all aim for is we want people to all be represented. And it just so happens that your tribe oftentimes happens to share race. So like I live really close to a big Hispanic area. And what they're interested in, their problems, their economic situations, they're to a certain extent, it's theirs. We'll have some similarities with like other ones, but like if they don't have representation, that's an issue. So one of the ways that we get that is sort of like it's a non-organic way, which organic always works best, but non-organically they're trying to promote that. And I think that a lot of times it's done poorly. And I feel bad because that guy, your son, it feels kind of disenfranchised from a solid identity. He feels kind of like isolated, and that's lonely. I get that, and the fact that he was the only semi-colored kid, even that sucks.
Which, if you and your wife have a child, you may have. I mean, you talk about ripping your heart from your chest.
Mhm.
When I married his mother, I mean, I think I've been very fortunate in my life to be um, uneducated to some bad things,
Yep.
if that makes any sense.
We all have. Yeah.
When I met his mother in the military, she was the most striking and beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my entire life. And when we had a child, it wasn't about, you know what I mean? All of the little idiosyncrasies didn't exist in that world, right? We lived our life. But the trouble, right? And I hope we grow as a country before you get to that point with you and your wife having a child and having to go through that.
I doubt it. I hope that. I doubt it.
I do too. And that's my biggest fight, because I know you've just probably wanted to punch me in the throat at times when you see my fight against the BLM movement.
No.
And the fight is just having one specific group. In my mind, you can't say you have to care about me right now and then have not the white culture, but the Hispanics or the Asians saying, what the crap, dude? Right?
My wife feels that way too. She's like, I don't know if I can speak into this right now with like some of the atrocities that are happening to Hispanics, and like the fact that there's still like these detention camp things that Trump created that are literally prisons, and like they're being abused by the officers. There's no reason that the kids should be there separated from their parents, and they are, and it's still happening. There's a lot of racist things that happen, and she doesn't feel. I'm just kind of jumping off what you said. She doesn't feel like she has the podium. It's Black people's turn, and we've talked about it. And I think one of the things that we arrived at was just that it's a bite into the problem. We're taking it one bite at a time, and it just so happens that there's more history of abuse towards Black people than anything else, and there's more proof for it. There's more statistics. There's just more. There's more law.
I'd actually argue that point, because what we see in our history right now with the Black culture is literally happening real time with the Hispanics, whether it's through migrant workers working for substandard wages, which may not be slavery, but
it's meeting in the middle for them, right? They're like, we'll do one step above.
Yeah. So my fight, and I mean, I've had some very heated arguments with people when we start talking about all of these different cultures. But, you know, with my son's mother, I learned a lot about the Hispanic culture based on the fact that, you know, her dad wasn't in the picture and her stepfather was Hispanic. So they raised her within this Hispanic culture. And they had 77 cousins and 84, you know what I mean? This huge community thing. But I got to see her parents were illegal immigrants. They still are. They live in Texas, and they've lived here for, I don't know, 38 years. Never got a visa. They just moved to the United States.
Yeah.
So I see all of this stuff, and I say, well, it's great, you know, that you want to talk about the history about one specific group, and then all of a sudden we have to care about this. But there are some real atrocities happening, real tragedies happening current real time, like you're talking about with detention camps and I mean, God, it just goes on and on and on and on. There's all kinds of things, and I my fear, Andrew, my fear is if we focus all of our attention on one group, that BLM group, even if we progress it here and we're just not paying attention to this over here, that it's going to make it's just going to exacerbate the problem. You know, that problem doesn't exist right now because all of our attentions are focused over here, and that problem just keeps growing. You know what I mean? So where does that community, I don't know, and I'm not even trying to start an argument with you, but at what point do we realize that we have to progress everybody that's in very similar circumstances.
Yep.
And
I'll bring, like, since I'm an SEO and you're an SEO, and a lot of the listeners might be SEOs as well. The way that I handle an SEO campaign, if I want to succeed, is I identify one thing at a time. There are some things that I can do at a wide level. So site-wide schema, I can do that. I can do some like technical stuff for like site-wide speed things. But and there's usually some trickle-down stuff too. So like me getting links, sending it to the homepage, there's some trickle-down effects. But if I'm gonna keep the client, I gotta rank single pages for single keywords essentially. And it's not just about the keywords, but there's a lot of things that bring in traffic at that point. So I have to focus page by page. And if I'm trying to optimize my time and budget, I have to narrow in and just focus on this. I acknowledge that, hey, this other stuff exists. We need to make sure that at a bare minimum, it's not becoming toxic to the entire system. So like, I'm going to focus on this one page, but I'm also going to keep aware of like this thing also exists. And if it, for whatever reason, becomes an issue where now it's going to get in the way of us optimizing this one page, then that needs to be dealt with too. So there needs to be some, what I'm imagining is something to do that in real time with race issues. So if we're talking about, Black Lives Matter, that's one thing. And then we've got Hispanics, and that's another thing. But there's going to be some things as we're focusing on Black Lives Matter that trickle down and help all minorities, just like it does with Website Authority. There's going to be some areas where it's not fixed. But generally, if you're, by focusing on Black Lives Matter, they're almost the symbol for all minority oppression to a certain extent. And if you're focusing on that, I don't think it's just going to happen in a vacuum where these reforms only affect Black people. I think Hispanics are also in there. And I think Blacks also, I mean, when they're saying Black Lives Matter, they're not saying no other life matters or anything like that either. It's just, I think they also recognize Hispanics are also in similar boats as them. But they're speaking from who they are. They are Black people oppressed.
I'm going to give you a challenge.
Yeah.
Okay, that I want to have a further discussion about something.
Yep.
And not today, but that discussion is the percentage of children going to bed hungry every day here in the United States.
Yeah.
And breaking that down by culture. Because most of my efforts and most of my activism is for children, right? Mm-hmm. I realize that I don't have the bandwidth like you're talking about. I need to go after two things.
Do so much, yeah.
Yeah, I help the veteran community in certain ways with the homeless population, but my main focus is children because children don't get to make choices. So one of the alarming things that you see, and this is probably where my fight comes from, is I looked at, 20% of the children in this country go to bed hungry every night. Mm-hmm. That's an alarming percentage. Yep. And then you break down that 20%, and just like you were talking about your 50%, 50% of the prison population, you realize that 60% of the 20% are Hispanic children. Mm. And that kind of gives you some insight, you know what I mean? Because these are people who are working for substandard wages or whatever that is. And that kind of caused my shift in thought process when I saw those numbers. Because it's not anything you hear on the news. It's not anything that's convenient to talk about. And it's an alarming number of, and I don't know, we got to do better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because when you said, when you look at that 60%, and it was actually I think it was like 61 or 62%, I said, okay, so 61, 62% of the 20% of the children that go to bed hungry every night in our country, that's, excuse my language, that's fucked up, right? I mean, that is like, we should put everything, we should put everything away for just a moment and fix that. Does that make sense? In my mind, right? Yeah. I'm not saying we can or will, but in my mind, I was like, wow, we have a lot of adult problems, but let's go back to the kids. So my challenge is let's have a conversation at some point. You do your research. We're both really good at doing research. And then let's talk about that because I care about what your point of view will be on that subject. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that it'll actually intersect with some of this stuff too. And it also makes sense why that's your thing. Because in your story, you felt hunger, man. And like you were afraid for your son being hungry too, and worked your ass off to make sure he wouldn't be.
And that's kind of my fight against white privilege. I'm like, where did my white privilege happen?
I totally get it. And I think that's I have more. I think I'm just going to leave some of it. People can go. I've basically covered all of it other than one thing. So this is the 10% that I was going to say that is white privilege. So wait, can you see my screen?
No, I think I got to share. I think you got to go in and share it again. I don't know.
Stop sharing.
Yeah.
Share screen. Share screen. There it is. Share. Is it working?
No. Here, I'm going to add it.
There it is. Okay, so these are some just things that I think relate to white privilege. Being accepted in greater frequency by strangers. Never having a moment where your skin alone makes someone hate you. Being the only one of your race in class, work, town, neighborhood. Finding that most ads throughout history catered to white people and used white people. Seeing personal grooming products that cater toward white hair types, skin tones. Finding your race heavily represented everywhere. Having leaders that are primarily your race. And like we've talked about, these leaders understand your culture more. We're all limited to the cultures we exist in. A person calls 911 to report the presence of a person of color who's otherwise behaving lawfully. A police officer shooting an unarmed person of color because he feared for his life, and having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation do. Then there's things like GI Bill. Post-World War II benefited whites greatly and turbocharged white vets into the middle class. Then we have, to this day, more than 80% of poor black students attend a high-poverty school, where suspension rates are often higher, resources are more limited. Black Americans are 105% more likely than white people to receive a high-cost mortgage, while Latino Americans are 78% more likely. So these are just areas where privilege exists. And anytime, I'm never going to stick where like I can make a sweeping statement and say that like it's always this way and whites always receive this thing. But when it's generally true, is all I'm saying is like there's a privilege that white people have in that we're not historically, first of all, we've had ancestors that are able to build up wealth longer. We don't have laws preventing the building of wealth. We have people that understand us and represent our needs. And there's an important psychological effect that also happens just by seeing people like you that are doing great things. So superheroes even, man. I once doubted this, but it is important. People actually identify. They have heroes. And it's heartbreaking when my wife tells me things that like she knows people that they refuse to dream. They say, we don't get to dream. That's not a thing. Like dreams aren't for us. And it's literally just like, how do you get those kind of people out of that mindset? Oftentimes it's having heroes where they can see themselves in them. And I wish it was just as easy as, a black person should be able to see a white person as their hero. To a certain extent, yes, and plenty do. But it's more seeing people who rose out of your situation, your exact situation. So I just think that those are like small things that just sort of point out what white privilege is. But then what is racism? This is the last definition is systemic racism happens when these structures or processes are carried out by groups with power, such as governments, businesses, or schools. Racism as individual and group level processes and structures that are implicated in the reproduction of racial inequality. Let's see. It's important to realize that all people of all ethnicities belong in the debate over racism. White people too. You cannot throw someone out just because they aren't, just because I'm white doesn't mean I can't talk about Black issues. Um, I think the same thing with being male or female. It's a sticky issue. I'm not going to get into that. And once again, it involves a 20-page paper to be able to fully flesh out. But we all belong in the debate. So people sharing uniting principles and characteristics, that's what allows us. We're human. So we have all of these different uniting factors. And I personally believe we're created in the image of God. And as a result of being image bearers of God, that is where we all have value and where we all are now should be speaking into each other's lives. That's what gives us the ability to do that, is that shared attribute. So we're all rational. We're empathetic beings, if you want to use the scientific term instead of made in God's image. But I think that even though I'm on a more liberal side with this, I think it's important to not demonize any one person just because you've seen liberals that are irrational in areas. Doesn't mean they're irrational in all areas. Same goes for Republicans. We all do irrational things. Don't write off someone just because of that. It's called poisoning the well. It's a logical fallacy that's thousands of years old. It's also straw man. It's another logical fallacy. I encourage people just to read about logical fallacies because you'll start to see them in politics and news all the time, and maybe even your own beliefs. But
I get a lot of people who try and push me into that, and I think they don't really see what my position is, right? When we start talking about the rioting that's happening in Portland or Seattle or Chicago or any of that stuff.
Yep.
That they don't realize that my position comes from the most basic standpoint of human decency and the value of a human life. Right? So my fight, going back to the military days, is there's a lot of things that I did that negatively impacted human lives. And my mission moving forward is realizing the value of life, is to put myself in a position where I'm in clear disagreement of any action that potentially harms like a rioter versus a police officer. That's a person, right? Now, whether you agree with whatever the politics is, doesn't allow anybody to go in and cause physical harm that dad doesn't come home tonight or mom doesn't come home tonight. And I think that's my biggest issue with just being so adamantly angry about our current situation, regardless of what the city is or the cause. That even if you took the United States out of it, I'm never going to agree with causing harm to people in order to progress an initiative. It's just counterproductive, and it causes more harm than good. It's just it's tough. So the question I'm going to ask, and I always ask one tough question, is let's assume if we could only make one single step, because part of progression is moving one step forward. In your mind, what would that most important step be? You only get to choose one, because progression has to start somewhere.
Who's making the step?
You could be the person in charge. You're the person in charge who has to make a decision that we as a group, as a whole, have to make the next step forward. Not based on history. You see what I'm saying? And I know that's a tough question, because knowing what that step is half the battle, right? Identifying the problem is halfway to getting to a solution. So I get asked that question all the time. I want to see what your answer is, right? If you said, hey, tomorrow we're all going to wake up and we're going to all be on the same team, and we're going to put all of our differences aside. For every reason, we're going to put everything aside, and we're going to take the next step as mankind to further benefit us as us, right? Because now we're taking the same side. So what is that?
I think it is, if you want to change something in the next 3 months, go talk to someone. If you're anti-Black Lives Matter, go talk to someone who's part of it. Go break bread, have a meal, one meal in the next 3 months. Find someone. Go to a church. Go to a barbecue. Go to your neighbor. If you're in an apartment complex, find somebody. Literally, maybe just reach out to Facebook groups and ask, "Hey, I'm looking to have a conversation or a meal with somebody who's in this thing." I think that's where it starts. If everyone did that,
Communication.
then it's doing what you're doing right now, which is it's demuddying the waters. It's making people love each other. It all starts with that, man. I'm not a hippie, but if you don't love your fellow man, then you have no business starting a revolution, and you have no business leading a reformation.
That's really the basis of these interviews, right? So if you look at the single shows where I'm just talking about headlines about stuff that pisses me off, I mean, that's a whole different type of episode. But I went into this thinking, let's just find America's voice. And I think if we start talking, we find common ground, we can learn not to hate, then we can learn to like, right? And then we can learn to love, because a whole bunch of things can be accomplished through love.
Everything, man.
Never be accomplished through hate. And maybe I need to, maybe I'm a hippie. I don't know.
Well, I think it's a fallacy to believe you can legislate morality and you can legislate every single change. It's weird because I have a friend who's from Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's Pakistan. I can't even use his name because he asked not to do that. But he's experienced a lot. But it's interesting. He said something that was like, he talks about how each culture identifies themselves. And America is a culture that identifies itself in legal terms, which I just thought was really interesting. It's the first culture I know of that has done that. That's very, very legal driven. So it's just interesting that the way by which we expect change to happen is through legal decisions. So Supreme Court, let's say transgender movement, we'll say how we treat Black people, how we treat Hispanic people. I don't think that's the way. Like, it's good to have laws, but it's almost like we as a people, we even kind of know that it's a lie. We know how things are changed. Mm-hmm. Things are changed by being inconvenienced. It's you yourself doing something that is hard, and people don't want to do it. And if you want to change something, spend some time, investing in loving the opposition. I think that's one of the best parts about Christianity is that when Christ is asked about, what to do, it's loving your enemy. And I don't think I really understood what that meant until marital fights, when you never really have like a true feel that enemy sort of thing, mm-hmm. until like you've just been like, God. And then you remember that sort of thing of like, Proverbs talks about how to diffuse a situation. It's in love. And the fool is quick to speak, and the wise man is slow to speak, and meets anger with love. And there's a way that like that just sort of diffuses things. Fire and more fire just creates more fire. So I think that I think that's the way, man. I think you're doing some of the right steps right now, and I think that just an action item to start trying to hang out with more people that aren't in your little echo chamber. Yeah, because you're never going to challenge yourself and grow if you stick in that same thing.
That's kind of what I think that's what drives people crazy in dealing with me, even my personal friends. Mm-hmm. Right? So I have my different compartments of friends. I have my vet friends that I really don't want to bring around my professional friends because, well, we tend to talk about different things.
Yeah.
And opening up and realizing what what's important. But I'll share something with you that happened about 2 years ago. And it was, I tend to be a dick about certain things for the right reasons. So I set up I wanted to test my friendships. These are my real personal friends. We're not talking about social media. And so what I did was I set up a JDRF walk team at Mall of America. And I said, if you are my friend, you have three options.
Yeah.
You can either show up and walk with us.
Mhm.
You can say, hey, I can't make it, and make a donation to JDRF because it's all for charity.
Yeah.
Or actually four options. One, say, hey, really love it, but I can't afford it. Right? I don't care if you get $1 or if you just show intent. Or four, do all or none. And immediately following that, because I was amazed at who showed up, and we put it out, and here's all of these things, and I said, this is important to me because it shows a person's character and charity. And then I immediately went back and said to everybody that didn't show up, we're no longer friends.
Mm.
Some of those friendships had been in place for 20 years, but I finally drew the line that there were the fence sitters that just they were never going to do anything but be takers. They were always there with their hand out, and they always needed something. And I just wasn't willing to give anymore. And then I took my 20, 30, 40 friends, and we're still friends. And we show up in similar environments, and I'll literally say, the one guy came back to me and said, are we friends again? I said, we'll never be friends again. You had one thing, right? You had one opportunity and you failed. You failed the test, and good luck. But that's actually probably one of the most refreshing things that I ever did in my life. I didn't realize how much dead weight that I had.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think maybe people need to do that now. Maybe people need to do that more. Identify who's really on their side, and bring the people with them that they truly share ideals and visions with, for the right reasons.
I don't know if it needs to be the ideals and visions. I think I have people in my life that I love that don't share that. And it's interesting. As a Christian, I'm called to be around people that specifically don't share my vision. Basically, I'm supposed to enter into depravity. I'm supposed to enter into chaos and be a stable, pillar of love, strengthened by Christ. I'm not able to do it on my own. And it's a call to be basically like around primarily a lot of people that don't share your convictions. And I don't think that, while I do acknowledge that for your really close group, I think you need that. You need ideals and visions that are like there. But then there's another like outer layer. We'll call them like best friends. We'll just use like the high school and like middle school term. Best friends, and then like acquaintances and friends.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't get rid of all of them. But I definitely would say that like it is unwise to be around somebody who does not value your vision and value your ideals. And if you're going to spend a lot of time with them, that's poisonous. So sure. I think I just wanted to find like a middle ground and say like, you bring a lot of truth in what you just said, but I want to make sure that people don't use that also to write off, too many people. And once again, it's like, you'll never grow with your ideals because no one else matters. It's just like my core group of things.
That gave me the opportunity, and we could close with this because I know you got to go, but that gave me the opportunity to open that door for more people to walk in.
Yes.
My space was crowded with a whole bunch of people, just that dead weight that they were never going to take that step forward with me. Yep. And that's why I think it's important that people keep that open. But anyhow, let's wind this down. I know you got to go, and I appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to the next one where we, let's look into that.
We'll solve the world problems together.
Well, on the child hunger thing, that just drives me crazy, and I think we could have a great unbelievable conversation about that.
I'm gonna send you a video later that I think you'll dig. It's about
Yeah.
that. But yeah, we'll talk about it later off air, off recording.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, man.